Opportunity is often described as universal, yet for women across the Middle East, it remains uneven, not because of lack of talent, but because systems stop working once education ends. Across the region, women complete more years of schooling than men. Yet, the region records the lowest female labor force participation at 20% compared to a global average of 48%. Educational gains do not necessarily translate into equal opportunity. Barriers as unequal pay, limited access to childcare and safe transport, restrictive norms, and gender based violence persist. My guest today is Maysa Jalbout, a leader in global education and international development who has spent 30 years shaping how education, policy, and philanthropy intersect across the Arab world and beyond. Today, we'll talk about gender in education and philanthropy, the choices that have shaped her journey, and why she believes lasting change depends on aligning values, policy, and people. So, hello, Maysa Jalbout. It's such an honor for us to have you here with us and to talk about gender, education, policies, and also your amazing journey. Maybe we can start a little bit there. How did you sort of get into this whole world of philanthropy, education, and policy making?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor. I'm a big fan of Meme Foundation, and I'm so glad you're using this podcast to discuss the critical issues that the foundation is trying to have an impact on. What started me on this journey is really my own personal experience. As a young girl, I was born a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, and my family experienced war and displacement and ended up in Canada eventually. There, I got access to an amazing quality education and opportunities that I would have never imagined as a young girl. And that really was what drove my, curiosity and passion and gave me meaning. Um, and I started off working very much at the local level in the city that I was living in, supporting young, what we called youth at risk, homeless youth at the time. And realized that disadvantage and challenges are not unique to people from this region, people like myself, or people who are displaced. People face disadvantages everywhere, even in rich countries. And that's how I started and eventually ended up working at the Canadian International Development Agency and eventually led to the path that I'm on today, working on education to support the most disadvantaged boys and girls in the world.
Is it really the educational system that plays a key role from your experience? What gave you that opportunity?
So I think it starts at home.
Mhm.
And for me, not going to school was not an option. My mother, my grandmother, my entire family would have just not accepted that.
You've also undergone a very difficult part of your life as a refugee. And how much has that also been transformed into something that you're able to empower other refugees or other women in similar situations?
Look, I think going through any kind of hardship, and in my case, living through war and having been a refugee, it makes you more resilient. In my case, it drives me. It gives me this sort of intrinsic passion. It's, of course, not enough in and of itself to actually create change and help other refugees. I found myself many times over the years as I traveled the world and worked with refugee communities and sitting across from women, mothers, and asking them, what is important to you? What help do you need right now? More often than not, one of the top three requests they have is putting their kids in school. I've had mothers say to me, I would rather not eat than send my daughter to school because they feel it so, they feel that their whole future rests on that. And it's so critical to them. So for me, I mentioned that, my mother said, you will go to school. That's that's the end of the story. When I sit across from these women, I think this is enforced time and time and time again. So it's like fuel for me, but it's also research. So I can put that in a report that's presented to philanthropists, to donors around the world to say, this is not a secondary objective. This is a need. This is a request from the people who need help the most. Education and the space of refugees is very much about hope. People who are displaced, whether they are in Gaza or whether they are, in Sudan or in Yemen, education is a lifeline for them. It's a place where they can see themselves not only overcoming their own personal challenges, but it's where they feel like they can become true citizens of the world, equal to everyone else. My grandmother, who was illiterate, never had a chance to go to school, used to tell me all the time, I wish I could go back and go to school. And I think a lot of our grandmothers, um, would say that because she would say, it would be like my power. It's the only thing no one else can take away from me. When I see what um, people inside Gaza are doing, including today setting up tents, that are getting flooded to get school restarted, to get basic, education tools to kids, despite all the odds, despite that they have nowhere to live, nothing to eat, they're cold, but they're doing that. So we are, for those of us who work in this sector, we think, how dare we feel hopeless? Because they are guiding us. They are so hopeful, they are so persistent. So we need to rise to meet that.
Is there improvement in the gender gap? And also, on the other edge of the sword is, why is there this big gap?
Look, for sure, there have been advancements, and you can feel them all around. You can see them here in the UAE. We're very privileged. We see a lot of women in leadership roles, whether they are heads of companies or in government. And that visibility and representation really does matter. But it's unequal across the region for many different reasons. One of them is what I just mentioned, in that some economies are just not producing enough jobs for everyone. Some countries are, have greater barriers. And we can talk about those barriers. So, for example, really, really importantly, as a region, we are doing much better on access to education and completion, to the point where in some countries in the region, women are far surpassing men in graduating from university. And in very many different sectors, including STEM, which is very competitive, and women participate in much lesser numbers in the world. So we're doing a lot better. But where we are not doing as well as we hope is in that transfer, in the gain that we could make from women graduating from university into the workforce. And here it gets a little more complex, in that one of the issues that we see is that women enter the job market but don't stay in it. And that's largely because of their responsibilities as mothers or caregivers. One of the most critical missing elements is the fact that women still carry the burden of care, whether it's for their children or for their parents, sometimes for extended family as well. And therefore, one of the most critical solutions that we need to see is improving investment in the care economy so that more women can work and also take care of their families. And so that is both a government policy as well as a corporate policy. Of course, as and I know this as a mother personally, it very much takes a village to raise a child. And so we are still, as a culture, very much uh, fortunate in many ways, and that is different than other cultures, is that we have community, we have family. Oftentimes, our mothers and grandmothers and our aunts are the ones that are chipping in when you're sick or you have to go to work, or so that's very, very important. We're very closely knit communities, but we need government also to help support that by subsidizing care, by introducing firm policies that support women in being able to work. And we need companies to step up, to really support women in this. I remember personally, I'm going to tell a little story when I was setting up the Queen Rania Foundation in Jordan, and I was working for Her Majesty Queen Rania. We had, a heart to heart about the fact that I wanted to have a second child. And um, I wasn't going to be able to carry on with my job because, it's very cumbersome. And I couldn't imagine how I was going to manage a child and this job. I'm setting up a foundation. And she looked at me and she said, "Are you kidding? We're going to make this work." And she set up a little creche in our office. And I would come in to work with my baby and was able to breastfeed her and check in on her and felt completely secure and a lot less stressed out if I was late or, wasn't able to, get home on time. And then, of course, other women were able, and who worked in our office, were able to use that crash, and it really changed everything. It changed the number of women that were leaving. It made the working environment so fundamentally inclusive. Um, and of course, um, it spoke so incredibly, you know, well of the person that we're working with, in the sense that she was advocating for these policies and she practiced them right in her office. Um, and now, as somebody who leads organizations and discusses this with philanthropists and other government leaders, um, I encourage them to do that at small scale, like in this case, or large scale. And, you know, people always come back and say, what a massive difference that's made for them.
Have you, maybe from your own personal experience, feel that when women are leading or co-leading with, fellow men, it's not just that, but how does that sort of translates back into the overall company? Does it change the dynamic when it's female-led or co-led?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really does. What's most essential is to have women around the decision making table. It doesn't necessarily always mean that they have to be at the top of the company, but they have to be able to influence policies, or at least inform policies. So many companies today, whether it's in the UAE or across the region and the world, do want to recruit more women, retain more women, and put women at the top. In order to do that, they need to be informed by women who have gone through those experiences themselves, and also women who are coming from different backgrounds, have different experiences, because we're not all the same. We talk about women as if we're all the same.
Yeah.
We have very many different experiences. We have different backgrounds, cultures, families, economic circumstance. So it's not homogeneous. And those policies need to be as diverse as women are.
Hmm.
We also can't forget that men need to also be a part of this. Um, some of the best companies for women's policies have men as advocates as well. Earlier, I talked about how critical family support, especially a mother's support for a girl's education and how far she goes in her education. Just the same, um, the father's support is critical. The employer's support, if it's a man, is critical. And so, it's a partnership with everyone who's at the decision making table. Um, my colleagues or friends often joke that for those of us who have been in leadership positions or have been privileged enough, to lead teams and whether it's companies or philanthropies, we often say our biggest superpower are the men that we marry because they are so critical to sharing responsibility, to encouragement, to facing challenges, just as women support men on their journey, in their work, in their family, in
Hmm.
their struggles. Equal partnership in marriage is also critical.
Absolutely.
So, um, you know, for young women who are listening, choose wisely.
Hmm.
Choose someone who is going to support you on your journey, just as you will support them. So that's also critical.
How can we support women like her, who are not necessarily in the top or the C-suite?
Interestingly enough, one of the questions that I get asked very often when I'm, out in universities or meeting with young women who are looking for jobs, or even ones who are still making a choice about what they want to study and the
Hmm.
line of work that they want to take, is they ask me, how do I balance being a mother and working? So they're worried about it before they even start. And so you're right to say that we need to address this issue and create a support network for women, not just at the top, but at all levels. So, this is where it's super critical to have multiple approaches. Women supporting women, for sure, at all level, families, communities, friends, mentors. One of the greatest opportunities for us is to mentor women formally and informally. I get asked all the time by young women, where can I find a mentor? And, there are structured approaches to that. There are less informal approaches to that. But we need to ensure that we do a little better on that in corporate structures, but also for those of us who are able and have the time and the resources to take young women under our wing. My biggest mentor has passed away now many years ago, and I still find myself sometimes when I'm facing a tough situation think, what would he think? What would he say? And having that kind of support, that kind of you know person that you can go back to with your sort of deepest insecurities or advice based on their life experience is so so critical. Coming back to
Hmm.
sort of the um, policies, I think workplaces need to be just more open. Women and men need to feel secure and safe to be able to speak to their peers and their supervisors about the challenges they're facing, the things that are worrying them, and the opportunities that are available to them, uh, so that they have, clarity on what's possible. And sometimes I think especially women, we do this to ourselves. It's self-ingrained in some ways, is that we don't ask for help. We give help, but we worry about asking for help. If you have a sick child at home, you really fret about it, and maybe if you ask to work from home that day, it's not the end of the world. Maybe if you know one of one of the advantages of Corona,
Mm.
uh, is that we learn to work remotely, and it had its disadvantages for sure. But one of the incredible advantages is we saw a surge of women who started working online.
Mhm.
In some communities around the world, the number of women working from home, because they could balance home and work, doubled. So I think now as we are seeing a return to work, policies come into play, employers need to balance that and need to remember that, uh, while, yes, we need to see teams working together more closely, it's important to have that connection. For many women, particularly if they are mothers, it's going to be important to have that flexibility. Whether
Yeah.
your child is an infant or you need to be there for sports in the afternoon. Oftentimes, women who are giving flexibility like that will work doubly as hard as when they are actually in the office. And we have statistics to back that up. So those are just some
Mhm.
examples.
How do we ensure that this is really an investment in women, in furthering their role, their well-being? Because sometimes, like, you feel that it's just a checklist. We need this number of women on a board.
It's not that we don't have women on
Mhm.
boards. We've had women on boards against all odds, for a long time. I think what it does provide is a framework for a benchmark, towards progress. It also encourages cooperation and looking for solutions. So I know of many companies in the region that are asking the question, how do we get more women on the board? So then it becomes less about, a checklist and more about, okay, how do we access these women? Who do we speak to? Why are they, what are the barriers for them to serve? Sharing for those who do have increased participation on their boards, the benefits of having women. I mean, boards that have women report higher profit. They report more innovation because they bring different perspectives. They do better in things like DEI. So there's actually a ton of incentive and real benefits for corporations to have women. So it shouldn't be driven by government policy. It should be driven by it's better for the bottom line. And that's what companies are there to do. But it is a bigger issue, right? It's an issue of, we just talked about how women are always strapped for time because they're struggling between their job and their family commitments. Sometimes things like serving on a board become a time commitment that they cannot afford. I struggle with that myself. I'm often thinking, I'm on too many boards. I can't commit more time. I should prioritize this or that. We all do. But I do it because it's so critical for other women, for younger women, to have that visibility, to see that women can do that. And also because I feel so passionately about the boards that I am on. I feel that I have a lot to give, a lot to learn, and it, it has that ripple effect. So we also have to demonstrate that, that we add value. If anybody listening wants to be on a board, I have a lot of boards that are looking. And we have so many incredible women in this region that have so much to give. They don't need to be at C-suite. They need to be at boards because they know their community, because they know an issue very well, because they're innovative, because they're incredibly educated, um, because they love their, their country, their region. Um, we just need to do it.
Do you recommend anything specific in terms of how these models can be applied across the region?
Oftentimes, and I get asked a lot of questions by philanthropists, who should I fund if I want to support the humanitarian response in Gaza? Or who should I fund if I, you know, um, want to support education in Lebanon or what have you? Um, and oftentimes philanthropists, because of promotion and presence and historically sort of the approaches that have been taken, look to international organizations as the first port of call. They'll go to the big international organizations. But increasingly, some philanthropists, and I think Meem Foundation is doing a great job in this, is to look to communities and to look to local organizations and local experts to ask critical questions. Who's doing what? Who's been showing up day in and day
Mhm.
out? Um, w- you know, who's having real impact? And not shying away from that it may be a little more difficult to work with a group of small organizations rather than, contracting one large
Mhm.
organization. And investing in a local leader, like we're talking about, like a social entrepreneur who has credibility and commitment and has been there for a long time. um, so a really great example of an organization that comes to mind that fits that, and I know actually Meem Foundation supports them, is an organization called ULIP in Lebanon. um, ULIP stands for United Lebanon Youth Program, and it's led by a wonderful social entrepreneur by the name of Melek Nimir. And she's been working quietly in supporting education for refugees and underserved Lebanese communities in Lebanon for now a long time. And she makes it her business knowing those communities inside out, knowing their families, knowing the hardships that they're facing, and then creating the kinds of solutions that meet people where they are.
Mhm.
Does this child need tutoring? Does this child need access to small amounts of money to be able to do the SAT test? Does this child um, need a scholarship? Who can I call to get a scholarship for this person? It started off like that, very grassroots, and now she has programs that have grown. People, through word of mouth, different philanthropists know about her, and the organization has grown to the point where she's now able to serve larger refugee populations, not just in Lebanon, but in other places. Um, had philanthropists not, and when I'm talking philanthropists, I don't necessarily mean just ones who are running institutions and giving millions of dollars. Sometimes it's just a family deciding that, our zakat this year is going to go to educate
Mhm.
somebody, and calling somebody like ULIP and saying, I want to pay the tuition fee of this child this year. And that's good enough.
Yeah.
Because if many people do that, then institutions like that and communities like that will see much bigger impact, will
Mhm.
see scale. I just want to touch on this point of scale, by the way. We often think of scale as a solution that one genius person is going to come up with. Scale in development is not that at all. It really does take a village. Sometimes you do need that social entrepreneur that has that grit to run after a problem, but it takes a village to come up with scale. Scale looks like many people giving small amounts of money or giving time, or governments and businesses and philanthropists and community organizations working together, or countries getting together and saying, this is, a crisis that we want to solve. Scale is all of us doing something small. It's that ripple effect. And I can't really emphasize that enough. We need to stop looking for scale as some technology solution that's going to come and solve all our humanitarian problems. Technology can play a very um, important role, and increasingly so, but solutions are going to come from people committing to make an impact every single day.
Interestingly, you've mentioned two philanthropists. So you mentioned Melek Nimr, but also Meem Foundation, that is a woman-led, Iman Al Gurg. So it's quite curious that we see more women also in philanthropy and leading philanthropy. What what are your outlooks towards that? Is it changing the dynamics of philanthropy?
One of the most effective ways that women are philanthropists is at the community level. A few years ago, I was in Nablus in Palestine. I was visiting with a Najah University, and we were talking about scholarships. I happened to go to have coffee at in a family that I knew there, and they said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm here to visit the university to look at their needs around scholarships." The woman jumped up and said, um, "We do philanthropy here." And I said, "I'm sure you do. Tell me more." And she said, "Well, every Wednesday, uh, every first Wednesday of the month, all the women in the community gather and we talk about community needs. And one of the things that we talk about is scholarships. And we collect money and we go to the registrar because we know the families and we know who's studying and we know who's struggling. And we very quietly tell the registrar that, we're here to pay the dues of this student. And it's done. I have to say that was one of the most moving moments of philanthropy that I'd heard of. Just the genuine grassroots, the humility in that, no ego. I just thought it was so humbling. Here I am coming in with, on behalf of a philanthropic institution, to solve a problem. And she gave me a very important life lesson. Philanthropy starts at home. And it really kind of was that moment where I had to think, right, must not forget this. How do we work with local philanthropists, right?
Mhm.
If I'm a philanthropic entity coming into a community, I should ask first, what are they doing? What are they solving for? How can I work with them? And I'd love to give just some examples. I think I talked about um, impact investing and investing in social entrepreneurs. It's still a very nascent concept here in our region. And yet, we have a growing community of social entrepreneurs. So there's a need for patient capital. And, it took a woman to start the first regional impact investment fund. She'll probably hate me for saying this, but Lubna Alayan has started the first impact investment fund. And it's going to change this whole sector. And as a philanthropist, um, and she's been a philanthropist for a long time, but she's choosing this, and this is true of the example that I gave before. She's choosing a very collective and collaborative approach. And that's one of the key differences that we see in women philanthropists, is that they don't go it alone. They look around and say, who can I collaborate with? Second, they choose to address system level problems, whether it's a community or a national level or sometimes international level. They're a little more future looking, which is really interesting if you think about it. So, they address some of the issues that sometimes are deemed, too costly by traditional organizations. So they'll fund education, even though it's a long-term issue. Education is not something that produces results
Yeah.
today. They address women's health, which is something that is often underfunded. They look to solve problems over the long term, and that's really, really important. And a really good example of that is Mackenzie Scott. She's come in to philanthropy and made this splash, not because she's, speaking at every conference or seeking recognition, but actually changing the formula entirely by funding the organizations that are on the front line, without the fanfare
Hmm.
and no strings attached. Many philanthropists, especially traditional business leaders, go into the space saying, we will not fund operations, we will only fund results, leaving organizations on the front line struggling to pay staff, to pay fees. They have money to support their beneficiaries, but they don't have money to run as an organization. And Mackenzie Scott has said that makes no sense. I'm going to give the money to the organizations, and I trust-based philanthropy. I trust them to do the right thing because they've been doing it far longer than I've been funding them. So it's a really important way that women philanthropists are changing the space. I reference collective philanthropy, but it's really important to underscore that in that we're seeing a rise of women's circles in philanthropy. So where women's, just like I referenced the Nablus example, but formalized, where women seek other women to come together in a collective to fund issues that they together can solve much more effectively. And I would love to see that take hold in our region, because we have so many talented women who can learn from each other, who can collaborate. Um, Especially now, what I would call sort of second generation philanthropists. Many of the philanthropists that are rising now, their families have been doing philanthropy for generations. But I think many of them are ready to take different approaches. So it would be wonderful to see them come in collectives.